My name is Mike Levin. I run the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University, and this is a website where you can find all the primary papers and data sets and software and everything else from our work. And this is my own personal blog where I try to say what some of these things mean, or at least what I think they mean. Uh, Today, I'd like to talk about some new science that I think really intersects with issues that, as Buddhists, you're probably interested in. And I want to make clear, I am not a Buddhist scholar. I don't have an extremely deep knowledge of the classics in this field, but I think I know some of the big ideas, and I think it's extremely relevant. And we do a lot of this work in concert with our collaborators at the Center for the Study of Apparent Selves. So today, what I'd like to do is talk about a few issues and some of our work that sheds light on it. Now, in 25 minutes, I really don't have time to show you very much of the primary data. And actually, I'm going to make some fairly unconventional claims, and those usually need to go with all the primary data. So I encourage you to visit the website and look at the actual papers, because there's a ton of empirical research and material that goes into some of the things that I'm going to say today. But I'd like to just give an overview first. So one of the things that we've been working on is a framework for recognizing and ethically relating to a very wide range of unconventional beings, and I'll explain what I mean by that. In order to really understand the full range of other minds around us, we need to understand the origins of our own bodies and our minds. And I'm going to talk about a few things. First of all, show you how bodies self-assemble from an agential material. And this leads to an issue that I sort of call femto-Buddhism, this question of how far down on the scale of organization do these kinds of concepts extend. I'm going to talk about selves as not permanent objects, but rather a kind of self-telling, continuously morphing story that holds together the components of a body and a mind. And I'm going to argue at the end that there actually is good evidence for a non-physical component to our kind of architecture, that is a kind of ingressing mind as a pattern in a sort of Platonic space that basically comes through the physical body as an interface into this conventional physical world. And overall, I think we really need to understand a wide range of new kinds of beings who live out their life and suffer and strive for goals and so on in spaces other than the familiar 3D outer world of behavior. And this is going to challenge our commitment to enlarge our own cognitive light cone to be able to exert active compassion for all sentient beings, because some of these are actually very hard to observe. And this framework, I would claim, has led to very specific, practical, novel discoveries. In other words, most of my lab is a wet lab that generates advances in regenerative medicine, bioengineering, AI, and things like that. And so the philosophy really matters a lot, and we try to keep it very tightly integrated with the science so that there's benefit in both directions. And I think both science and concept of Buddhism are going to need to be updated in the future. So the first thing I just want to point out is that when we talk about compassion for innumerable beings, we have to understand what beings are. And this, in the Western world, this is the kind of view that predominates. This is a piece of classic art called Adam Names the Animals in the Garden of Eden. And the idea is that there's a discrete set of physical, familiar, embodied forms, plants and animals. And Adam is sort of unique, but it's his job to, quote unquote, name the animals. Naming in these traditions means that when you've discovered or given something a name, it means you've understood its true nature. Okay, so that part I think is profound, that we are going to have to understand the true nature of many different kind of beings, and it is our responsibility. But what I think is wrong or limiting here is that it really only is showing these kind of conventional brainy sorts of bodies, and this is only the beginning, the tip of the iceberg. Because the standard modern human, which features so prominently in both philosophy of mind discussions and just in general in religious traditions and so on, is at the center of two continuous distributions. We all started life as a single cell, both on the evolutionary scale and on developmentally. And what happens is that we all slowly and gradually become what we are now. And so whatever we think about the properties that we have in terms of the ability to hold goals and be responsible for our actions and so on, we have to have a continuous story that says, how do those things scale up from the time that you're a single cell? Where exactly, if we can conceive of that as this like yellow sort of golden agential glow that this thing has, where did that actually show up? At what point during evolution and during embryogenesis does that occur? But also through biological changes and technological changes, there is a wide range of intermediate forms that are not only possible but becoming real right now, and will be more so. And again, one has to say, at what point do our human possibilities and responsibilities kick in? And where do they extend? So using this as a sharp category of beings that need to make decisions and be responsible for themselves and so on is really not going to do. We have to understand this how it changes and how it scales with all kinds of novel scenarios. And this means that whatever discussions we have about Buddhism and AI and so on, it's really not just about AI. The point isn't about software agents. The point is that these kinds of cyborg creatures that are composites of technology and of natural evolution are already with us. They are going to be living with us, and in fact, this is going to be us, all of us. And so we really need to understand what this means for the various philosophical traditions. Now, partly, part of this is to understand where we actually come from and how we get here, specifically how our bodies get here. And so, when we look at an embryo, what is it that we're seeing? Because really there are just millions of cells. What are we calling an embryo? And so, if we look at an embryonic blastoderm here, what allows us to call this one embryo, what it is that we're counting, as we say, here's a single being that's going to come into the world. What we're counting is actually alignment. The fact that all of these cells are in agreement about their journey in anatomical space and where they're going to go and what they're going to make. In that sense, the embryo is a kind of self-reinforcing, highly compelling illusion. It is an illusion because really what you have is a bunch of cells, and it is only an embryo to the extent that the cells believe they are all working towards one goal. On the other hand, it is an enabling vision. It's what enables them to project their will into anatomical space and become this amazing higher order construct to make a body. And this is kind of a self-reinforcing thing, because the more that pattern gets taken up by cells, the more they reinforce that pattern for each other, and all of them move forward and create something like this. I will point out that the number of individuals in an embryonic blastoderm is not fixed, because if you make little scratches in it, each one of these islands will not feel the presence of the others, and it will self-organize into an embryo. So you could have anywhere from 0 to about half a dozen individuals coming from the same embryonic mass. So again, we have this idea of how many actual selves are there in a particular piece of this self-organizing medium, and this is a very dynamic process, and you can have twins and triplets and quadruplets and so on. And the same issues actually come up in cognition, where you have split brain patients and dissociative identity disorders with multiple individual personalities sharing the same brain real estate. So this is how we are formed. We are formed through a persistent kind of self model of that develops in these cells. And this is what we're made of. These are individual cells. And so what you can see here is how the molecules have become a form of unicellular life. And down here you see a very sad kind of video where you see the reverse process, how the death of the unicellular organism leads to just a bunch of organic molecules, just a mess of molecular remnants. And so so what we're seeing here is that below the single cell level, and you can see that even though it doesn't have a brain or a nervous system, there's tremendous purposeful action here. The cell is very competent in getting its goals met in its environment. So what you can see here is that below this level are the molecular networks that underlie it, and the border between a bunch of molecules and presumably the province of chemistry and physics lies right next to it lies the province of life and behavioral science and things like that. And the border of life and death here is very thin once you looked at it at this level. So this is what we try to think about is how far down do the concepts that we're interested in go, in terms of delusions and having false beliefs about yourself and the outside world. What's going on here? Do these cells have that? Do they generate karma? Are they in need of liberation? And we might agree that the answer is probably yes, because these are very clearly active living organisms. But because they're made of molecular networks, the immediate question then becomes, well, did the chemistry have those things as well? Can chemistry make mistakes? Can chemistry be diluted, to have attachments, generate carbon, and so on? Because if they can't, then you have to have a good story about why these molecules don't have it anymore, but they did seconds ago when this whole thing was an organism. So we really need to understand what's going on in that transition. And by the way, I don't believe there is any transition. I think it smoothly scales all the way down. Because and part of that is that we actually found that molecular networks themselves, not cells, but actually the molecular networks themselves also have, for example, 6 different kinds of learning. And so and we use this in our lab to do things like drug conditioning and so on. We can actually train molecular networks in addition to different, habituation, sensitization. They also do Pavlovian conditioning, and so even the material that you're made of, the very chemistry that you're made of, already has learning capacity. It is not a passive medium. It's not even just a computational medium. It is an agential medium that we are all made of. And I really think that a lot of the concepts that we think about go all the way to the bottom. This has an implication. The implication of this is that embodiment, as we traditionally recognize it, so for example, here we recognize easily medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds through three-dimensional space as intelligence and so on. This is only the beginning of the story, because actually biology lives in many different spaces. Cells and tissues and molecular networks, they navigate other spaces, very, very weird high-dimensional spaces that are hard for us to recognize. So they live in worlds like transcriptional space, meaning the space of all possible gene expression. They live in physiological state space, and the one that we spend the most time studying is anatomical morphospace. This is the space that you traversed from being a single cell, fertilized egg, to the body shape that you have now. All of these are spaces in which these systems make decisions. They strive for goals. They suffer, meaning that they have stress when their goals are not met, and they work to minimize that stress by navigating those spaces to the goal states that they have. This has, for example, massive implications for embodiment in AI, because when people say, "Well, this AI is not, it does not have a real mind because it is not embodied," meaning that it is not traversing our physical space, interacting with objects the way that we do, that actually doesn't mean that it's not embodied. It may well have a body that navigates other kinds of abstract spaces, and that perception, action, stress loop may play out in lots of spaces that we have a hard time noticing. I want to show you what the collective intelligence of cells as it's moving through the anatomical space. It has attachments to certain goals. For example, this is an axolotl. It's an amphibian that can regenerate many body parts. And what you see here is that when they inevitably bite each other's legs off, no matter where the amputation takes place, the cellular collective very quickly works. It works very hard, spends lots of energy, and it gets back to where it needs to be. And then it stops. In other words, while no individual cell knows what a finger is or how many fingers you're supposed to have, the collective has this kind of homeostatic loop where it has a goal, it has a set point. If you deviate it from that goal, it will traverse back there. So it will travel through anatomical space and get back to where it needs to go. So it has a very active and very powerful attachment to this particular goal. We study the way that stress drives this process, and the idea that you can sort of have a very basal model of attachment and suffering by looking at the stress-driven pursuit of these goals by groups of cells. In fact, there's something else going on here, which is that there is a kind of holistic order to it. In other words, if this tail is surgically grafted to the middle of this animal, what will happen is that the cells will actually slowly remodel it into a limb. In other words, a structure more appropriate to the new large-scale anatomy. And even the cells at the tip of the tail, will become fingers, even though locally there's nothing wrong with them. So what you're seeing is that, again, the collective has an attachment to a specific goal state in anatomical space, meaning that it knows that having a tail in the middle is not correct. It needs to have a limb. And that desire, the pressure to do that propagates down even into the individual cells, which locally there's no problem. They could have stayed like this, but they don't, because the imperative to make a correct larger scale structure filters down to the molecular networks that guide these individual cell behaviors. So you've got this idea that the whole thing and the nature of this body is literally held together by the collective shared model of what they should be doing. And what makes it a tail as opposed to, or a limb as opposed to just a pile of individual cells, is their collective goal of making sure that they have roughly the right configuration. And so you see here that that shared goal states are kind of organizing principle for keeping a new self together. The anatomical self here is literally, much like an embryogenesis, is literally held together because of this kind of cognitive glue, the shared goals and the stress of not making it. And and our biological substrate, we call this a multi-scale competency architecture. Excuse me, multi-scale competency architecture, where every layer is able to solve problems and achieve goals in the different kinds of spaces. And so now we have to ask how how do these systems remember their goals? What is the cognitive glue that allows a collective to reach a group goal? Yeah, so how do these group goals actually bind individual subunits together into new beings that are distinct from? So you've got the goals of your molecular networks, but then there are those of the cell, and there are those of the tissue, and of course of the entire organism. So this is conventional behavior here. But then anatomically at the level of the organism, and so on. How do they remember it? How do they pursue these goals? Well, we know how this works in the brain and nervous system. So there's an electrical network in your brain that allows very high level abstract goals that you might have around right action and whatever, to filter down to actually change the chemistry of your muscle cells to make your muscles contract so that you can do voluntary motion and go execute on those goals. So it's actually an amazing architecture that allows very abstract kinds of principles to control the chemistry in your body. And so these electrical signals control your muscles so that you can move through three-dimensional space and have actions that generate consequences and so on. But it turns out that evolution discovered this a really long time ago. So this is an ancient architecture. All cells in your body actually have these ion channels and electrical synapses. So the electrical network of your brain actually evolved from a much older electrical network in your body. And what that electrical network thought about was not action in the three-dimensional world. It thought about action in anatomical space. In other words, it issued the networks of cells issued commands to each other to move your body configuration through anatomical space. That is how it remembered what a proper embryo looks like. That is how groups of cells remember how many fingers you have and you're supposed to have, and all of that kind of thing. And we've done a lot of work to develop the first technologies to read and write the mind of that collective intelligence. And so we use the collective intelligence of cells as a model system for understanding, for detecting, and trying to communicate with a very unconventional intelligence that lives in this anatomical space. Just want to show you what some of that looks like. So the colors here in the grayscale represent voltages that we can read out with a voltage-sensitive fluorescent dye. This is an early frog embryo putting its face together. Here's one frame from that video showing you the memory of what it's going to do to build a face. Here's where the eye is going to form later. Here's where the mouth is going to form, and so on. These electrical pattern memories control all of the gene expression domains and ultimately the anatomy. This is literally reading the mind of the body. And you can see the individual cells have all sorts of interesting electrical properties, and they're having all sorts of electrical conversations. And much like we try to read out, or at least people in the neuroscience field try to read out the mental content of your brain by scanning your electrophysiology, we try to do the same thing in the body and understand what this collective intelligence is trying to do. Once we understand, we call this cracking the bioelectric code. Once we have some understanding, we can actually speak that language, and we can issue commands or communicate with it to try to reset its goals. So for example, here's a tadpole side view. Here's the eye, the brain is up here, the mouth and the gut. Whereas these cells normally have a very stable goal of making a gut organ. What we can do is issue a communication to a few of these cells using this ion channel RNA and ask them to build an eye instead. And sure enough, they take on that new goal, and they will do so, and they will build an extra eye. And this eye has lens, retina, optic nerve, all the same. In fact, they commit to that goal so well that these cells that we injected, these blue cells, will actually recruit from their neighbors. All these other cells in this eye are not directly injected by us, but they are recruited by these cells to participate with them. It's such a compelling vision of the future. They actually transmit that vision to their neighbors, and you can actually see that happen. So The other thing is besides being able to change goals, once you understand that cognitive glue and how these bodies come to be held together, we can actually reset the borders of the self. So when we look at this, individual cells, both in space and in time, have little tiny goals, things like keeping the pH or the hunger level at a particular range and so on. They have little tiny goals in space and time, but groups of cells can merge together into collectives, networks that can remember much bigger goals, such as this. They can remember these grandiose anatomical goals. So the degree, the size of the scale of the goal that you're able to pursue rises in evolution and in embryogenesis. It gets bigger and it gets projected into new problem spaces, from physiological space to anatomical space. And so these kinds of things are intensely practical because you can use them to drive to drive biomedical interventions. So for example, this is our approach to cancer. So here, if you put in a human oncogene, it will make a tumor. In these cells, you could see already by the bioelectrical imaging, they're basically disconnecting from their neighbors. And once they disconnect, they become individuals like ancient amoebas. They sort of roll back to their past. And as far as they're concerned, the rest of the body is just external environment. They're going to go live their best life, which is metastasis. And we can prevent that process, not by killing them, not by fixing the genetic defect, but simply by forcing them into a correct electrical state that keeps them coupled to the network. When we do that, then they don't have these individual little thoughts about crawling off and doing other things. They basically stay on task in this giant mind meld, and they build skin and muscle and so on. This is the same animal. Here's the oncoprotein blazingly expressed. There's no tumor, because it's not the genetic state that drives, it's the commitment and the size of your goals. And if we can keep that boundary between self and world large enough so that they remember these large organ level goals, then this is a new kind of therapeutic that we're working on. And so the idea here is that the scale of the largest goal that you can pursue, we call this the cognitive light cone, which is in space and time, the largest goal that you can pursue, not how far your senses can reach, or how far out you can affect things, but the size of in whatever space. It doesn't have to be physical space. Whatever size is the largest goal that you can pursue gives us some interesting ideas. And this is, you can see this that worked out in this paper, that area of concern, the goal states that you're pursuing, really can be thought of as also a kind of cone of compassion. And wouldn't it be interesting to think about in the Bodhisattva vow as a commitment to enlarge our own cognitive light cone to comprise bigger and bigger groups of sentient beings as part of our primary kind of circle of compassion. And so all of this is discussed in this paper, where we talk about it forming a kind of loop as a driver of intelligence, the increase of this cognitive light cone. So in the last couple of minutes, I just want to talk about the implications that this has beyond natural beings that were evolved, whose bodies were evolved by an evolutionary process, because I think this is really what the Garden of Eden is going to look like. It's going to be much weirder than the original, and this issue of care and the cognitive light cone is kind of at the center of three really interesting domains of research. I want to introduce you to one creature. You might think this is something we found at the bottom of a pond somewhere with an ancient genome. We call it an Anthrobot. These are actually comprised of adult human cells. In other words, we take adult human tracheal epithelial cells from patients, some of whom are deceased. So this is a weird kind of life after death for that patient. And these cells self-organize into an entirely new creature that has a new morphology, a new sets of behaviors. This does not look like any stage of human development. It's a completely different kind of being. We haven't touched the genome. We haven't put any reprogramming factors, no synthetic biology. This is what the cells already know how to do. These have never existed in evolution. And so one might wonder, these kind of behaviors that it has, it expresses about half the genome, over 9,000 genes, in new ways, other than what the cells were doing when they were inside the body. They have lots of new behaviors. One of the things they know how to do is to heal neural wounds. So for example, these are human neurons. We made a big scar. These things, big scratch rather, that's a neural damage. And these things are gathering together to heal it. You can see here, they're healing it across the gap. So where do all these come from? If you can't blame a long history of evolutionary selection for it, I mean, there's never been any anthrobots. There's never been any selection to be a good anthrobot. Where do the goals and the preferences and the sort of attachments of novel beings that have never been here before, where do they come from? And so I also want to point out that it does not take cells, it doesn't take life, it doesn't take huge complexity to do this. Even extremely simple models, and I don't have time to get into this, but you can see some of this discussed in this paper and also on my blog, where even very simple things like bubble sort, it's a simple computer algorithm, about 6 lines of code, totally deterministic. Even they have interesting competencies like delayed gratification, and they do weird side quests besides sorting numbers that are literally not in the algorithm. Even something as simple as bubble sort has apparent desires and competencies that are not in the algorithm. And so we have to be, I think this is a really important point, that these kinds of things go all the way down into very simple systems. I think we tend to greatly underestimate the capabilities of matter and of quote unquote machines, and for the exact same reason that the story of our mind is not fully encompassed by the laws of biochemistry, the story of quote unquote machines is not encompassed by our formal models of algorithms and materials and so on. The same kinds of things apply to even very simple systems. And I do not actually believe there's any such thing as dead matter. I've been in debates with people, for example, from the Vedanta school, who want to keep a very strong separation between the magic of life and so-called dead matter. I don't believe there's any dead matter anywhere. And so just to finish up here, I will point out that when we start to ask where do these patterns of behavior and these goals and competencies arise in biologicals that have never been evolved, but also simple technological constructs and hybrids and so on. When we ask where do they come from, I think the best answer currently is that they come from the same place that the structure of mathematical objects come from. In other words, not from physical space. I think that there is a kind of Platonic space of forms. Some of them we recognize as low agency things like facts of number theory and so on, and others are highly active, highly complex forms that we would recognize as kinds of as propensities for behavior, aka kinds of minds. And I think we are the residents of this space that occasionally project into the physical world through physical bodies, through interfaces like biological bodies, like biobots, like computers, machines, and so on. All of these can serve as interfaces to highly complex non-physical patterns that come through. And scientifically, we're currently very bad at recognizing when that's about to happen. And this is really important because we are living in, and increasingly are going to be living in, a world where the biological endless forms, most beautiful in Darwin's phrase, are just a tiny little corner of this whole space. And we are going to have to learn to enter an ethical synth biosis with beings that are extremely diverse, many different combinations of algorithms, of engineering, and of evolved life, and the ingressing patterns that form our minds and our psychological profiles need to be understood as they come through these interfaces to enable us to have a mutually flourishing experience. And I will stop here and just say that all of this is discussed in many papers. Happy to send these to you if you're interested. And I thank the students and the postdocs who did all the work, including especially our collaborators in this specific field that I talked about today. Our many funders. I have to do a disclosure. These are 3 companies that have commercialized advances that have come from this kind of thinking. And of course, I always thank the model systems, both living and non-living.